Once upon a memory, at the far end of the Mediterranean Sea, there lay an island so beautiful and blue that the many travellers, pilgrims, crusaders and merchants who fell in love with it either wanted never to leave or tried to tow it with hemp ropes all the way back to their own countries. Legends, perhaps. But legends are there to tell us what history has forgotten. It has been many years since I fled that place on board a plane, inside a suitcase made of soft black leather, never to return. I've since adopted another land, England, where I've grown and thrived, but not a single day passes that I do not yearn to be back. Home, motherland. They're the opening words of Elif Shafak's latest masterpiece, The Island of Missing Trees. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Williams. I'm the Artistic Director of Sydney Writers' Festival, and I'm thrilled to be back at Adelaide Writers' Week for another year. In fact, give yourselves a big round of applause for being at a festival. I can see many masks in the audience. You're all being COVID compliant. That is a very good thing. I'd ask you to refrain from spontaneously embracing one another through the session. I know that's going to be hard because it's exciting to be here to celebrate literature. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and members of their community who are with us today. We don't acknowledge country as some kind of rote recitation. We do it because we're stopping to take stock and think about the context in which the conversations we have today and the stories that we hear today, the context that they belong to. And with an author like Elif Shafak, it feels especially important to pause and think about the nature of intergenerational silences, absences, memory and trauma, because there's no one writing novels today, I would argue, that does a better job of it than she does. Please make her very, very welcome.
No, actually, I was so happy, so thankful to hear you read those words. So really, thank you.
Now, Elif is the author of 19 books at this point, translated into 55 languages, has so many awards, accolades, and is kind of one of the great, as I say, writers about the nature of memory, of loss, of trauma. The Island of Missing Trees is no exception. It's such a beautiful book. And I guess the reason I wanted to read that passage from the opening is the echo and resonance from that to the beginning of your acknowledgements at the back of the book, Elif, where you reflect, when I left Istanbul for the last time many years ago now, I didn't know I wouldn't be going back. Can you talk to us a bit about that idea of exile, of writing a book like this when you're personally so removed from the place that you're writing about? um, transcending geographical reality, but also transcending other questions of identity. Um, the, I mean, you left Turkey. You kind of understood the full realities of what it was to be removed from it after 2006 as the Bastard of Istanbul, and the kind of what must have been a terrible experience. Being charged under Article 301 for the crime of insulting Turkishness. And I'm interested in your reflections on whether, on what you understand Turkishness to be, and the ways in which that's a useful concept or not a useful concept.
Right, I'm shaking my head because, to be honest, no one exactly knows what insulting Turkishness means, right? It's so vague, and therefore it's quite open to all kinds of interpretation or misinterpretation. But if I may take a step back, in case there are people in the audience who might not know exactly what this is about, we have an article in our constitution that is supposed to protect Turkishness against words. And this has been used mostly against journalists, against scholars, particularly historians, but never before, it had never been used against the work of fiction. And when my novel, The Bastard of Istanbul, was published in Turkey, this is a book that talks about a Turkish family and an Armenian American family, but through the eyes of women, generations of women, grandmothers, mothers, granddaughters. And basically talks about memory and amnesia, particularly collective amnesia, and it does talk about the Armenian genocide, which is a very, very difficult subject in Turkey, and it's a massive silence in Turkey. So, because of this, I was accused of insulting Turkishness and put on trial. But in a way, since the work of fiction was brought to court in this way, the words of fictional characters had to be plucked, out of the text and used as evidence in the courtroom, which left me in a very surreal situation because my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian American fictional characters. And that madness went on for about a year. There were nationalist groups on the streets spitting at my pictures, burning EU flags, because for them, anyone who questions official history must be a pawn of Western powers. And then in the end, after a year and a half, after a year, I was acquitted with the fictional characters. But of course, it left a mark, it left a scar. And I think it was one of the reasons that contributed to my need to leave Istanbul.
We're certainly here in Australia. I think the equivalent is the frequency with which conservative politicians cite un-Australian behaviour as one of those similarly abstract ideas that is clearly, only the worst of us are un-Australian one way or the other. But it's a strange concept. Now, The Bastard of Istanbul was correct me if I have this wrong, but your second book that you wrote in English rather than in Turkish. And I'm just interested in that moment when you made that decision for yourself, that English was the language for your fiction, the language for the stories that you wanted to tell. And I'm curious about that transition.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question because I love languages, plural. I love letters. To me, it's pure magic that with a very limited number of letters, we can obtain endless meanings. That said, as you can hear in my accent, English is not my native tongue. I'm an outsider in this language, I'm a latecomer or an immigrant. And as many immigrants would know, there will always be a gap between the mind and the tongue. And so writing in English just balances for me a different way. But in a nutshell, I realize over the years, if my writing has melancholy, sadness, longing, I find these things much easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, which I really love, I think humor is like oxygen, or irony or satire, I find these things much easier in English.
That's so funny that that divide between the emotional and the cerebral and the uh, and tapping into humor. Do you find when you're writing a novel length work in English, do you find yourself occasionally having to write passages or sections in Turkish, or do you move between the two, or is your fiction writing space purely English at this point?
At this point, it's purely English because if I start thinking in two languages, I don't think I can do that, you know? So I try to stay in that space as long as I can, as deep as I can. Only afterwards, when the book is over, and it's also, if I may add this quickly, I have so much respect for translators, particularly literary translators. They do not get enough recognition, and what they're doing is amazing. I know some books that are not as good in the original as in the translated form because the translator in between has done, tremendous work. So all I'm trying to say is it's not something I can do myself. But once the translation is complete, all I can do is just maybe the rhythm, add some touches, words, vocabulary. That's what I like.
Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, Elif, and I'm sorry because the camera will only be on my face. So you don't
Without myself falling into the trap of nationalism, without myself falling into the trap of tribalism, how do you even approach such a story? How do you find an angle? I've been struggling with this for a long time. Only when I found the voice of the fig tree, then I found a gate into the story. So it might sound weird, but I really feel thankful to the fig tree. It was a bit of a risk for an author. It is a risk because if you make a tree speak in a novel, if it doesn't work, the entire thing collapses. But it felt, to my heart, it felt like the right thing to do, It was more organic, more natural. And I really believe we have so much to learn from trees. They were here before us. They will be here long after we've gone, and from a tree's perspective, actually everything is interconnected. We forget that so easily. We think we're the center of the universe as human beings. We think we're superior to all other creatures. There's an arrogance to the way we see everything around
I love that so much because, part of why I think this book is so powerful and so effective is that the voice of the tree very quickly goes from being a literary device to the tree is unmistakably a character and a voice in its own right. This is not a device, this is not a bit of authorial trickery. This is a character who you come to invest in and who is very funny, kind of dryly funny and observant um, uh, and a kind of testament to the idea of bearing witness that I think runs through so much of your work and is a kind of powerful demonstration of that. Did you, I have to ask not to get bogged down in the mechanics of it, but did the voice come to you fully formed or did you have to work at it to feel like you convincingly sounded like a fig tree and not some other kind of tree by mistake?
Yeah, strangely, it came to me almost in its full form. Like she kept speaking in my mind. I knew it was a female tree. I knew it was an immigrant tree. And one of the many fascinating things about trees is if you take a cutting from a tree and take that cutting with you to another country, elsewhere, and plant that cutting, if the weather permits, if the soil is good, that tree continues to live. It is both a new tree, but also genetically a continuation of the previous one. And that to me was important because, again, coming back to the immigrant experience, when you move to a new place, you leave a big chunk of yourself behind. It's not life you carry on as usual. Something in you dies, but then something else is born. So the tree allowed me also to focus on this notion of being rooted or uprooted. And it felt very spontaneously, her voice came to me.
I think that element of it is very important because the book exists in two discrete timelines, and that nature of the immigrant's decision about how much of home to bring with them when they make a new home, and explicitly how much they choose to share with the next generation is kind of one of the central concerns of the book. And so Daphne and Costas have decided for the most part to keep the stories about Cyprus from their daughter Ada. And so the book takes that as its kind of central conceit, is those silences and the question of what the obligation to the next generation is when it comes to the traumas of the past. That seems to me to be a theme that echoes throughout your work. Is that something of particular interest and importance to you?
It is. We always talk about family stories, but I think we need to talk about family silences as well, because they do shape us and they do shape next generations, those silences, just as much as the stories, actually. The fact that we do not talk about the past doesn't mean it has no weight, it has no role. Sometimes we walk around a gap, a void, but that void shapes us. second generation, because they don't know how, the second generation does not want to talk about the past because they have to find a new life, build a new life. They have to be future oriented, forward looking. But that means it's the third or fourth generations in these families, which means the youngest in these families who are asking the sharpest, the biggest questions about identity, their ancestors' memories. So I have met young people in very different continents who are carrying old memories.
I think it's one of the great achievements of this book that to tie those two threads together, that the narrative voice of the tree and the idea of nature bearing witness, you very effectively use that not to diminish the human experience, but to kind of celebrate it and highlight it. It would be very possible to have that kind of timeless overview and have the nature of kind of human worries feel small by comparison. And yet that's not what happens. It's a deeply kind of compassionate. There's the wonderful, this from The Voice of the Fig Tree, when Lawrence Durrell, having fallen in love with cypress, decided to plant cypresses behind his house and took his spade to the soil, he found skeletons in his garden. Little did he know that this was by no means unusual. All around the world, wherever there is or has ever been a civil war or an ethnic conflict, come to the trees for clues, because we will be the ones that sit silently in communion with human remains. I think such a beautiful, beautiful passage. I wanted to ask you about another project that you're involved with, just because there is the through line of trees with it and time, and that's the Future Library project that happened out of Norway. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but it's a kind of art project. I'm going to diminish it terribly by trying to describe it quickly, where 1,000 trees have been planted, and over 100 years, each year a different author is commissioned to write a book for a future library, and that book goes under lock and key and isn't seen for 100 years. And so that they build up this library, and after 100 years, the trees are used to print the books that have been built up over time. It's a really beautiful idea. And Elif was the fourth author, I think, to contribute to the Future Library, after Margaret Atwood, David Mitchell, and maybe Sean, the Icelandic author. And I was interested to note that your book, that none of us get to read because it's 100 years away, and I mean, a few people in this crowd will still be around then, but I certainly will not. You chose to write something called The Last Taboo, and I'm interested in that idea about taboo and silences and what time does to that kind of story.
Yes, what a beautiful question. As you mentioned, this is a fascinating, it's a wonderful project by Katie Patterson, the Scottish artist. In Oslo, they're building this forest and the library, and every book is handed with a small ritual of its own to be read in 100 years. I love this idea. Coming back to taboos, I think, especially in the case of Cyprus, this was an important question for me, while I was writing this novel. But in order to explain it, maybe I should mention when I lived in America, I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as a visiting scholar, and I have observed some Italian American families who would bury their fig trees if the winters were very cold, particularly stormy and chilly. So this is an old botanical technique. Literally, you prune these trees and the vertical tree becomes horizontal. You push it under the ground, you dig a trench under the ground and cover the tree. It stays there, and come next spring, you unbury the tree and it's alive and healthy again. So I was very intrigued by that. It's an important metaphor because in Cyprus, as you know, there's a bicommunal organization which is launched by the United Nations, but it's the Cypriots, it's the islanders who are doing the groundwork, Cypriots from both sides. Many of them are women, many of them are young people, and almost all of them are volunteers. So basically what they're doing is they're digging the ground to find the bones of the people who went missing during the time of the Troubles. And the reason why they're doing this is not because they want to revive old animosities or hostilities, just the opposite. They want to give the dead a proper burial, dignity, and the families a possibility for healing and closure. And of course, this was a very important issue across South America, in Guatemala, in Chile, in Argentina, in Spain after the Civil War, in Bosnia after the genocide, and most recently in Iraq with the Yazidi genocide. Today, there are Yazidi families digging the ground, looking for the bones of their relatives or ancestors. So I wanted to explore this. And writing about a tree in an interesting way allowed me to focus more closely on this issue of burial and unburial of secrets, but also human lives.
Do you see your work as a writer as analogous to that work of digging up the past to make sure that it is paid sufficient respect?
That's a very important question to me because, I always thought that Walter Benjamin has this beautiful analogy, metaphor, in which he talks about a work of, if you're interested in culture and memory, it feels like walking on a pile of rubble. And you're walking very softly and gently, trying to hear the voices from under the ground, trying to see if there's anything still alive under the pile of rubble, these ruins and remnants. You focus on them. That's what it feels like being a storyteller from a Turkish background. There are piles of rubble all around. So it's important to me to find those remnants of memory. And I also am aware that sometimes you can't find them in written culture. You need to pay attention to oral culture because things that have not been written down can be nonetheless remembered and transferred from one generation through another to another via tales or legends or lullabies or recipes. Sometimes food is a language, food is more than just feeding people. So you need to pay attention to oral culture as well.
There's such a wonderful passage late in the book. I'm going to try and find it. There's always a mistake, but I think where Costas is reassuring Ada, and Ada patted her father's hand. There was something childlike in the way grown-ups had a need for stories. They held a naive belief that by telling an inspiring anecdote, the right fable at the right time, they could lift their children's moods, motivate them to great achievements, and simply change reality. There was no point in telling them that life was more complicated than that, and words less magical than they presumed. I love that passage. It made me laugh out loud when I read it. The idea of the adult's naivety and the child's wisdom seemed pretty apt to me. But you, of course, believe fundamentally in that magic of story and the value of it, I imagine.
Indeed, yes. I mean, I do believe that words can make a difference. They can, of course, hurt. They can also heal. I also believe that stories in particular can rehumanize people who have been systematically dehumanized. I am not interested in focusing on the center, if I may put it this way. It's the periphery that intrigues me. Anyone who feels like the other, anyone who has been made to feel that way for whatever reason, if you've been pushed to the margins, silenced, disempowered, if somehow your truth has been erased, I'm interested in that experience. And there's a lot of that in the country, in the land or region where I come from. So fiction for me is a desire to make the invisible a bit more visible, the unheard a bit more heard, and change the power structure, empower, in a way, the disempowered. I like that rebellious nature of literature. I think at its core, it's pure resistance and rebellion. For me, that's what literature is a longing for freedom. And also it's an appreciation of diversity and multiplicity and pluralism.
Did I remember correctly that I read an interview or heard an interview with you where you cited Tale of Two Cities as one of the first novels you read in English and a very influential one? Is that right?
That is so true. Yes, I was very young, and it was published. A magazine as a supplement. They had published it with drawings and I colored each drawing. I can never forget. I was very young. Yeah, in Turkish I read it.
It just seemed apt to me because I think You are clearly such an extraordinary kind of advocate for questions of social justice and for marginalised voices and for human rights and all of that, but you're also such a consummate storyteller that there is real joy in the kind of the imaginative worlds that you weave. And I mean, as with Dickens, Tale of Two Cities was a historical novel when he was writing it. You seem drawn to making sense in a contemporary context of those kind of historical, large and small
True.
moments.
I think what I love is this canvas of a novel in which you have a chance to bring things that are not thought to, that people want to keep separate, that many people want to keep separate. I love that hybrid, those cultural encounters, cosmopolitan encounters, if I may put it that way. I like the novel because it's so nuanced, it's so multi-layered. But to be honest, I think if you happen to be a storyteller from a wounded democracy or a shattered democracy, such as Turkey or Brazil, but also Hungary, for instance. I mean, the list is getting longer and longer, unfortunately. Then you do not have the luxury of being apolitical or non-political. You can't say, I don't want to talk about politics. I only want to focus on my poetry or my fiction. I don't want to speak about what's happening outside the window. If what's happening outside the window bothers your conscience, you need to say something. Also, I am a feminist, and one of the many wonderful things I've learned from feminist movements of past generations is that politics is not only what Boris Johnson said today or what happened in the parliament yesterday. It's more than that. Wherever there's a power imbalance, there is politics. So you might be writing about sexuality, you might be writing about a marriage or heartbreak. That too can be quite political, actually. So I describe it in such a broad way. But the reason why I mention this is because I don't think writers should try to teach or preach. I don't like that. I find it very off-putting. I don't know the answers myself. It's a discovery. But what I think a writer's job is to ask questions, including questions about difficult issues, and open a space in which various views can be seen together, and then always leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. I've met couples who've been married for 45 years. They read the same book, they don't read it in the same way. I've met good friends. One of them loves that book, the other one not so much. Why? Because every reader brings their own gaze into the story. So it's the questions, particularly questions about silences, that I'm chasing. But the answers are always up to the reader.
I love that idea about being framed around questions. It's the great Nabokov quote that a question is insubordination in its purest form, which I think is a lovely concept. Are you insubordinate?
I I don't, I hesitate to maybe give a straightforward answer. What I do know, however, when I am writing, when I'm in the midst of a novel, that is the only space where I feel multiple. I feel like what Walt Whitman used to say is very true. I believe we do contain multitudes, but we live in a world that doesn't allow us to bring our own multiplicity out. It's just the opposite. We live in a world that constantly pushes us into boxes and expects us to remain in our own box once and for all. So, in a world of fiction, actually, all those boxes disappear and you feel free and you feel multiple. Also, I'm hoping for in the process of reading, also, we experience that kind of freedom, because for a few hours, for a few days, we become someone else. We never have to become someone else in our daily life, right? So that's a very good exercise for the mind and for the soul. It's a humbling experience. You start to question your own truths. It gives you a cognitive flexibility, and maybe helps to build our own emotional intelligence and empathy. So there's a lot inside fiction that can be quite liberating, in my opinion.
I think that's absolutely true when it's done well, and you are an exemplar of that. It's multiplicities there. In a moment, we're going to take some questions from the audience. I mention this so that you can prepare and frame your question and be ready to make your way to the microphone just down the middle there. But before we get to it, I am curious about amongst the things about which you are passionate and, if you will, anxious. I wonder how much writing from the perspective of a tree was a response to or heightened your sense about concern about the problems faced by the natural world and the climate crisis that we're in.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we are at such a critical crossroads. And of course, the decisions that we're taking right now are going to shape the next decades. And I'm not sure that we're taking the right decisions at all. I also think we cannot be single issue people, in the sense that if you care about climate inequality, climate destruction, ecological destruction, then I think we should also care about gender inequality. All the studies show that, when you look at the people who have been displaced because of climate change, most of them, many of them are women and children. And wherever we see such displacement, we will see, and we are seeing, a rise in sexual violence and gender violence. If you care about gender inequality and climate destruction, you also care about racial inequality, class inequality, regional inequality, digital, and so on. So for me, all of these inequalities are connected. We have to connect the dots rather than focusing on one issue. And we have entered a moment in history in which none of us can be disengaged. None of us can be disconnected, because things are happening so fast. We have major global challenges ahead of us, whether it's the destruction of our environment or the possibility of another pandemic, war, nationalism, ultranationalism, and so forth and so on. So the answer to all these challenges cannot be more isolationism, cannot be more nationalism, more tribalism. We're not going to solve these global problems with the forces of nationalism. And I think it's very important that at this moment in time we are connected, we hear each other's voices. So I believe in global solidarity, I believe in global sisterhood in particular, but especially cultural spaces in which we hear each other, we listen, and we have calmer, nuanced conversations. It's very valuable to me.
Coming back to that question about the divide between the kind of cerebral and the emotional, and language, and how you approach that, do you, when you're writing a book like The Island of Missing Trees, it seems to me that there's so embedded in it, there's so much grief, there's so much anger about injustice, there's so much joy and kind of search for connection. Do you approach your writing emotionally, or is it on a schematic? Are you kind of, these are the bits where I need to get, and I have to be dispassionate about it?
I always think, for me at least, stories come from the heart. That doesn't mean there isn't an intellectual background to it. Of course there is. But the passion, the emotion, needs to come from within. And in that regard, as long as that interest and emotion is there, we can dare to also write about geographies or places that are not necessarily part of our identity. For me, literature is more than, identity. But there has to be a genuine attachment, genuine emotion. I do a lot of research. Whatever I work on, whatever I write about, really a lot of reading and study goes into it. But my main guide is always my intuition. I think there are two different ways of writing a novel. In the first path is a bit more like, maybe it's more mathematical, in which the author wants to know what's going to happen at the end, knows the ending, designs each chapter. There's a plot, there's a structure. The author is slightly above the text. I have read amazing books produced in this way. I respect this path, but it's not my path. I like the second path, in which you're a little bit drunk, as you're writing. You don't quite know what you're doing. You do not walk in a straight line, and you don't know how the story is going to end. Sometimes the characters lead the way, or it's the language that leads the way. So I like the flow, and I think I like to let go as much as I can of my own ego when I'm writing and become those characters and let them guide me.
That's a beautiful articulation of that process. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I would ask that you make your way to the microphone so that Elif, who won't be able to see you, but she will be able to hear you, all going well. So we have one from the gentleman just here.
Hello, both of you. You really touched me. I came here rather than question, brief statement. I walked in half an hour ago, and I was talking one of the volunteers about. We started talking. I'm from Turkey, 50 years here, and you started. I heard it. And anyway, I came 51 years ago to study here, and one of my friends were, when Cyprus was invaded, he was shot down, air pilot, Air Force pilot. But when I came here, I got married to an Australian person, and her friend, Steve's wife-to-be, came from Nicosia, Greek side of it, and their wedding was not terribly happy. No, and it was a house wedding, and only two people outside the family, me as a Turkish background, and my wife as an early Australian. So it still touches me. This is 45 years ago or so, the wedding. And I've never been back because of the national service. I don't believe in it. And so thank you very much. You touched me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate that you shared this with us, with the audience. It resonated with me, your words. And as you said, we do continue carry the emotional pain, no matter how much time goes by, or we might be miles or continents away. I'm very grateful that you shared this with us.
Thank you.
Hi, Elif. First of all, I'd like to say it's been a profound pleasure to listen to you today. I wanted to ask you, in times of tumultuousness, like these ones are, what do you look for in literature, and are there certain writers you go back to, or who have you found, who have you discovered in the last 2 years who've kept you company?
It's wonderful. It's such a beautiful question. I think reading, just the process, the endless process of reading itself is important to me. In other words, books kept me company, like many of us, I believe, but also understanding the importance of seemingly small things, small moments, like the luxury of being able to sit under a tree reading a book. We used to take these things for granted, right? And then you realize that you shouldn't take them for granted. So I think we are at this moment in history in which we need to reconnect urgently, reconnect with ourselves, because we all have an inner garden inside that we're responsible for. We need to nurture that inner garden. Second thing is we need to reconnect with our fellow human beings. We cannot isolate, anyone. We cannot follow isolationism. And the third thing is that I think we need to reconnect with nature, with trees, with our environment, and realize that we're all part of an ecosystem. To be honest, fiction helps me a lot. I love fiction. That's where my heart beats. But I love to read across the board, both fiction and nonfiction. I think if it speaks to us in that moment, it's the right book for us. So I'm interested in political philosophy. I'm also interested in cookbooks. I never understand this distinction between highbrow literature and lowbrow literature. As long as it speaks to our heart, let's keep reading. But in my opinion, let's make sure our reading lists are eclectic, hybrid, across disciplines, but also cultures. So let's read from East and West, North and South. That kind of pluralism in my reading lists is something that helped me throughout this difficult time, of course, which is still going on. So books, but especially eclectic reading lists.
Thank you. And I would say, with the mention of cookbooks, if you haven't already read The Island of Missing Trees, don't do so on an empty stomach, because some of the descriptions of food, you know, you need to be full when you read it. Otherwise, you're going to run to the kitchen and make yourself deeply inadequate snacks compared to what Elif describes in these pages. A question.
Hi. I was 6.5 when I came to Australia from Greece. I was born there, obviously. And I find I love my heritage. I absolutely love it. I speak fluent Greek, okay? But I could not live in Greece as a feminist. How did you cope being a feminist living in Turkey?
Powerful question. I hear what you're saying. Of course, it's not easy because, you know, these patriarchal codes, they're so deeply rooted, right? And so widespread. It hits you sometimes where you least expect them to emerge from. So it's very pervasive within the society, within the culture. I'm speaking about the Turkish experience. But at the same time, that doesn't mean, of course, that women in Turkey or women in Greece are weak or victims, not at all. You run into, in the case of both countries, you run into lots of strong women, you know, in almost every field, from academia to medicine. In Turkey, it has become a bit more, far more dramatic in the sense that Turkey has been going backwards more and more in the last years and tumbling into ultranationalism, more religious fundamentalism and authoritarianism. And I think wherever that happens, we will also see an increase in sexism. We will also see an increase in misogyny, but also homophobia and transphobia. Always these things go hand in hand. You know, it's not a coincidence. So women are resisting, women are marching on the streets. Turkey has unfortunately announced that it's going to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, which was the only progressive international treaty we had. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is there are many women who are fighting back, but there's one area in which women are almost non-existent, especially as you move up, you know, the upper echelons of decision making, and that area is politics. So all the decision makers are conservative, patriarchal men above a certain age, and that changes everything. It's not easy to be a writer, a feminist writer, in such a context, because sometimes my books have been investigated by prosecutors and I was accused of obscenity. My books have been seized sometimes by police officers from my publishing office because I write about issues like child abuse, gender violence, femicides. You know, I write about these issues because they're happening. This is the reality, you know. So to me, it's very tragic that instead of doing something about this, instead of opening shelters for victims of abuse, instead of changing the laws and this patriarchal mindset, what the government, what the authorities are doing is to prosecute fiction writers who talk about these issues in their work. That doesn't make sense. So it is a struggle, but I think as Greek feminists, as Turkish feminists, we are connected. You know, our struggles are connected, and it's wonderfully inspiring and empowering to hear you.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I moved here from Istanbul back in 2005, and reading your story obviously touches me as well. I grew up in a patriarchal society that you have to always be in, what would be the word for it? You know, you have to be quiet. You have to always let men talk, and there was not much voice for women. And listening your story touches me because I feel I cannot watch Turkish news anymore because it breaks my heart. And in sense of living, I always felt no longer I belong there to Turkey. I moved here, I didn't feel like I felt like I lost until I had my own kids. And I'm like, now I belong to here in Australia. I went 2 years ago to Istanbul. I didn't feel like home anymore. and I still miss fig. Is so touching for me. And in Australia, I was like, found some Italians have Italian trees, and eating fig makes me feel like home again. Even though I'm in Australia, I feel like home. And for sense of you, how do you feel like you belong where? Like, do you feel like now you belong to UK, where you live, or do you, where's your home now?
Yes, beautiful. I think, yes, home is of course UK now, and I really, everything you said resonates with me. If I may take a step back, those smells, flavors that you were mentioning, isn't it interesting that those seemingly small things are the ones that open up actually our bigger memories, trigger memories. Sometimes I think, okay, I'm not going to think about Istanbul too much. And then whilst I'm walking on the street, if I pick a smell in the breeze, in the air of the scent of roasted chestnuts, it suddenly hits me because, the smell of roasted chestnuts for me is the smell of Istanbul. Even if your mind is not processing or thinking about Istanbul in that moment, something else is triggered. So that sensual side of memories, to me, is always very, very interesting. And the answer to your question, of course, as you know better than I do, is not easy in the sense that, of course, we have a strong sense of belonging in our adopted lands, where we feel more free as women, as individuals. But at the same time, there's an emotional connection with what we have left behind, which is actually very human. That's why I find it very important that we can become multiple in this life. If I may very quickly add this, in the UK, because of this Brexit saga, we have seen a rise in nationalism and tribalism as well. And we have been told by politicians that if you're a citizen of the world, then it means you're a citizen of nowhere. And my heart rejects that. When I look at myself, of course I'm an Istanbulite, of course I'm Turkish. These things will always be with me. But I also feel attached to the Balkans, the Middle East. I consider myself European. I have become a Londoner over the years. I have become a British citizen over the years. And despite what politicians are telling us, I want to call myself a citizen of humankind. That doesn't mean you're floating in the air, you have no sense of responsibility or belonging. Just the opposite, you have multiple belongings. As human beings, I think we have multiple belongings. So of course there's one home, but sometimes there's more to home than we see at first glance. And at the end of the day, I think for me, homeland, motherland, is always storyland. That's the glue that keeps all my pieces together.
That's so beautifully put, and I think a perfect note to end today's session on. When it comes to multiple belongings, I'm sure that there is a not insignificant part of South Australia that would happily claim you for here as well today, Elif. So you can add that to the list of places.
Thank you. Thank you.
I might give the final word to the fig tree for those who are missing or craving figs, or need a reminder of the ways in which the sensual grounds us in space and time. The fig tree is very skeptical about the story of Adam and Eve being around an apple, and is pretty clear that that is in no way plausible, and says, Adam and Eve shared a tender, ripe, deliciously alluring, aromatic fig, splitting it open right down the middle, and as the fleshy, opulent sweetness dissolved on their tongues, they began to see the universe around them in a completely new light, because that is what happens to those who attain knowledge and wisdom. Then they covered themselves with the leaves of the tree they happened to be standing under. As for the apple, I'm sorry, it didn't feature. The wonderful Elif Shafak's books are available in the bookshop. Please make her very welcome and thank her from us.
Thank you.